Hey Joe, how's it going?
Going all right.
Good, good, thanks. So we're gonna start with the recording.
Okay.
Okay, good. So I see it happening, and my lighting's still good.
Lighting's good.
Okay, great. Then I will check in with you at seven. No,
It,
at around 8.
okay.
Thanks a
Got it.
lot.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe.
Hey there.
Hey, I just wanted to check in, listen to some sound if we could. Uh, test, test, test.
Sounds good.
Test, test,
Sounds good.
test, test, test.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Just one other thing. Let's see. Okay, that's right. Test, test, test.
I heard the tap, tap, tap.
Good. Okay, that's good.
Tap, tap.
Test, test, test.
I hear you.
Okay, good. All right, great. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us. We'll begin in just a few minutes. Thank you for being here. Yay! I was 31 years old. I was sitting on a bench in Lafayette Park in the Pacific Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. 400 yards away from me, my husband was undergoing surgery. 6 hours of surgery. That was the maximum amount of time that he could be anesthetized. That was the maximum period for his surgery. We had been told that there was a chance that he might not come out of the surgery. And I was sitting there in that park, Lafayette Park, on a bench surrounded by lawn, waiting to find out. I was clinging to a book. I bought the book not 5 minutes before on Van Ness Avenue at Crown Books. It was a children's book. It was full of pictures on every page. There was some text, but mostly it was a children's book or a book for adults trying to regain childhood, trying to escape into childhood. The Battle of Guadacanal. I looked around me. I was surrounded by a lawn covered with leaves. The lawn with the leaves on it reminded me of pictures that I just discovered in this book, of vessels moving across a blue-green sea, looking like leaves, the battle lines of the American and Japanese fleets. I looked around me. I was surrounded by just those exact same kind of leaves. They lay on the lawn like ships on a battlefield. I was in the most active, indeed, the most aggressive denial about what was happening and what had happened. My beautiful Michael, my beautiful husband, had been in pain for months. And finally, he had gone to the emergency room and they told him that, in fact, what he had was cancer and it wasn't curable. I didn't know what to say to him. I felt completely helpless. My only experience was what I'd observed my parents go through, what I'd gone through, or movies. I didn't know what to say. My parents hadn't been through anything like this. I certainly hadn't been through anything like this. But in movies, if somebody was terminally ill, they always took a big trip. They always went away someplace for the last period of their life. So I stepped up to the bed and I said to Michael, I said, we'll go to Paris, your favorite city. We'll go to Europe and we'll spend the last 3 months there. And he looked up at me and he said, I can't go to Europe. I'm going to spend the last 3 months of my life here, hooked up to machines. I felt completely inadequate, useless. So I stopped trying to talk and say the right thing, and I just held his little hand and looked into his beautiful eyes. And I was just there. 3 days later, miraculous news, incredible news. It was not the cancer they thought it was. It was not terminal. It was actually treatable. I wasn't going to lose my beautiful boy. It was shocking. It was such a relief. But he would have to undergo a massive amount of chemotherapy. So for the next 3 months, and then longer, he was giving chemo every week. He got sick, nauseous. His beautiful hair fell out. He lost weight. He grew pale. He lay in bed a lot. Sometimes he would go into these mini comas and have to be rushed to the emergency room. But he kept at it. I was so proud of him. I was so impressed. I'd never seen anybody do this with such fortitude, such calm. And at the end of the chemo stretch, they said, he's headed in the right direction. He is. Now we have to go in there and cut out all the radiated scar tissue. And there's a lot of it. So he'll be anesthetized for 6 hours. It's a long time. We have to finish the surgery in that amount of time. And there is the possibility, although slight, there is the possibility that he could not come out of surgery, that something would go wrong. But he was strong as always, so strong. And he said yes. And then he said to me, he said, why don't we take a trip? It's going to be a few weeks until the surgery. I'd like to take a trip. And I said, yeah, really? Where do you want to go? He said, let's go to Kauai, that magical island in the Hawaiian Islands, paradise. I said, great, that sounds wonderful. So we took our credit cards and we bought 2 flights to Hawaii and a condo and a car, and we were off. We were off to Hawaii for the first time, to Kauai, to all that beautiful foliage. Da 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 da. And we climbed up the Nepali coast and then down into the bay to where the beach was, with waves crashing, which decimated me. I got ground into the sand by this wonderful wave. We ate our sandwiches, we drank our Coke, and then we went on this endless hike up this creek. It was a scramble to the very end of this creek. And at the end of this creek, we discovered a massive waterfall. And we stood under the waterfall, and I felt like that young lieutenant, yes, Nellie Borbush in the musical South Pacific. I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair. I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair. But I wasn't going to wash Michael out of my hair. I had Michael back. We were there. We were celebrating on Kauai, where that movie was filmed. It was amazing. And the next day we went for this big drive, and the rain was so heavy. I'd never seen it like that. It was like driving the car underwater. Da 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 da. And we drove all the way out to Barking Sands Beach, which was like the end of the world. It was amazing. The rain poured down. The light was magical. It was incredible. And Michael was so loving and fun. And he organized that whole wonderful trip, ill as he was. And I had the best time with my beautiful boy. And then it was over. And it was payback time. It was time to go back to surgery. And there I was, sitting in the park outside that massive concrete hospital, clinging to my book, trying to bury myself in that book, lose myself for those 6 hours that I had to wait to find out what the rest of my life would be. Now, the war in the Pacific I was reading was an economic war. It was a battle between the Japanese and the Americans. Now, you see, the Japanese considered the Pacific Ocean a Japanese lake. The Americans considered the Pacific Ocean an American lake. They both wanted to control the economies of the countries that surrounded it on the Pacific Rim. The Japanese felt entitled. They were from Asia, so they invaded China, Burma, India, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, but the Americans wanted that property too. They were trying to get their influence in there too. And they had been moving into the East, into Asia, all through the 30s. So there was a battle of wills between the Japanese and the Americans. And on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese brought it to a head. They attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now, the Pacific Fleet had to be destroyed. The US Pacific Fleet was massive, and it was the greatest challenge to the Japanese Navy. But the Japanese Navy was a little bit bigger at that time, a little bit more powerful. So they sent their carriers, their aircraft carriers, to Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, to destroy the American fleet. Now, the American fleet was composed of 2 capital ships, 2 types of ships that were considered capital, that were considered the important ships: the battleships, the big gun ships, and the aircraft carriers. The Japanese would have to get all the battleships and all the aircraft carriers to knock the US Pacific Fleet out of the war. But here's the thing. If they didn't get everything, they wouldn't be ready. They wouldn't have defeated the Americans. They came in over Pearl Harbor. There were the battleships all lined up, and they either sunk or damaged permanently, all of them. It was devastating. Some of those battleships never re-entered the war for another year. Others were destroyed right there. There are some still there. The Arizona, the Utah are still sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, where they were destroyed on December 7th, 1941. It was devastating, but the Japanese did not get the American aircraft carriers. They were nowhere in sight. Admiral Halsey had taken them out on a cruise the day before. He had no idea. It was just coincidence, and the Japanese didn't find them. So the Japanese had won a devastating strategic victory, but it was not decisive. So they need to push on. They need to find those other carriers. They need to sink them, but they didn't. They went home. They did not win a decisive victory. They didn't push far enough. They gave up. Having failed at Pearl Harbor, in June of 1942, the Japanese came back. Now they were going to draw the American carriers out. They sent their entire aircraft carrier fleet. The Japanese sent it to get the American carriers to come out. And of course, the American carriers had to come out because all the battleships were sunk. That's all the Americans had. So the Japanese carriers came towards Midway Island. And the American carriers came out to confront them. Now, in a carrier fight, it's whoever finds the other side first that wins. Why? Because if you sink the enemy's carriers, guess what? They can't launch any more planes, any more torpedo planes, any more dive bomber planes to sink your carriers. Also, any planes they've launched have no place to land. They have to go into the ocean and sink. The Americans found the Japanese carriers first. And 1, 2, 3, 4, they sunk 4 Japanese carriers. The Japanese followed the American planes home and sank 1 American carrier. It was still indecisive. The battle hadn't been won yet. Both forces were still there, so the Japanese could have still won it if they'd found the other American carriers. There were only 2, but they didn't. They went home. So again, they did not win a victory. Finally, the war would shift to Australia. Now, what was Australia? Australia was an ally of the United States. Australia was a huge continent, an island, which was basically functioning as a massive aircraft carrier and army base for the Americans. From there, the Americans could launch assaults into Asia. They could attack Japan directly from Australia. But the Americans would have to keep the sea lanes from the United States to Australia open so that ships, planes, men could travel from the United States to Australia. Now, if the Japanese could defeat Australia, and they couldn't attack it, it was much too big. They could never conquer Australia. It was a continent, but if they could isolate it from the United States, cut it off, then guess what? They'd win the war because the Americans would have no base close to Japan. So what did the Japanese do? They went to the islands that went right between the two, between the United States and Australia, the Solomon Islands. And there, on an island called Guadacanal that nobody had ever heard of, the Japanese built an air base. They started to build an air base. Now, this air base would put them right between the Americans and Australia. And any planes, any ships, any troops trying to come this way, they could go into the air and destroy them. If that air base was finished, it would be the end. Now, a man named Admiral King, who was head of the United States Navy, saw an opportunity. King was frustrated. He was incredibly frustrated because when the war started, President Roosevelt said, no, Germany first. We must defeat Hitler before we defeat the Japanese. Germany first. So Roosevelt was going to give 90% of all the American weapons, all the American tanks, all the American men, all the American planes, all the American ships to Europe. He was going to give them to Europe to help the British defeat Hitler, to help the Russians defeat Hitler. Only 10% of everything was going to go to the Pacific. But he could not deny Admiral King the Pacific Fleet or the carriers, which were the decisive weapons. He couldn't deny those to King. So King had a good fleet, but that's all he had. And he was incredibly frustrated because he doesn't care about Europe. He wanted to win all those economic markets in the Pacific. He saw that as the future of the United States, not Europe, not tired, dead Europe, but the Pacific. King had no troops. Roosevelt wouldn't give him any troops. But he saw an opportunity at Guadalcanal. If he could destroy that airfield, if he could take Guadalcanal, he could keep the sea lanes open from the United States to Australia. But how without any troops? So he scrounged troops together, the U.S. Marines, and he sent them to Guadalcanal. Now, the Marine Corps, they thought they were going to paradise. They thought they were going to Hawaii. They thought they were going to have a good time. Guadalcanal isn't like Hawaii. It's not a tropical paradise. It's a hellhole. It's rotting. It's fetid. It is disgusting. It smells. Imagine coming home from a trip. You've been away for a year, and you open up your refrigerator and smell your cottage cheese. Ugh. That's what it smelled like, but all the time in Guadalcanal. Yeah. You like fresh fruit? You like avocados and things? You think they're really beautiful? Imagine them rotting on you at Guadalcanal. That's what they did. They rotted on the soldiers. There was like rotting avocado all over the soldiers. There was like rotting tomatoes and guava and all sorts of tropical stuff rotting on them. It was disgusting. It was the most foul island on earth. It was covered with mosquitoes as big as your finger. It had bees and wasps as big as your fist buzzing around. And all of these animals carried disease. There was nothing but disease on Guadalcanal. Dysentery, typhoid, malaria. It was the most disgusting island on the planet. The beaches were terrible. It was not paradise, but they managed to get ashore. And the Japanese did not have that many troops ashore, so the Marines got it. They got the airfield, and the Marines finished it. And they made it into an American air base, and they called it Henderson Field, after one of the victorious pilots at the Battle of Midway. That's what it was, Henderson Field, and they were there. Now, of course, King saw his opportunity, and he started pushing everything he could into there. Reinforcements, ships, planes poured into Guadalcanal. Also, Admiral Yamamoto of the Japanese saw that the Americans were building up, and he got sucked into it too. He kept sending planes, ships, men to Guadalcanal. It was insane. They were getting drawn into this toilet, this vortex, this drain of hell, which was Guadalcanal. Troops, planes, men, tanks pouring into it. And nobody could stop the buildup. It became an obsession. So I emerged from this reverie, and I thought about what I was avoiding. And what would really happen? What would happen if my beautiful boy didn't come out of surgery? If this was the last event in his life? He was my whole world. I spent all my time with him. I told him everything. He was my husband, my best friend. He was my pal, my playmate. He was everything. And I had no sense of myself other than with him. I mean, we met in college, for God's sake. My parents, they never even met each other until they were older than I was at the time. They'd had a whole life before. They knew what it was to not have each other. And if one of them died, they'd have all these kids that they'd been raising. Yeah, they'd have to take care of all these kids. They'd have something to distract them from the grief. All we had was a cat. And the cat didn't even really like us that much. He was everything. And if that didn't work out, what was going on as I immersed myself in this battle, I'd have nothing. And what the hell does this have to do with Guadalcanal? What the hell? Nothing, except as a distraction, except as an escape. So reinforcements were pouring in. Everything was coming in. From Japan came the Tokyo Express reinforcements. From the United States, ships were pouring in more Marines, more Army soldiers, more everything. Now, the Japanese also started to bombard. They'd park their ships off the coast at night and bombard Henderson Field. The Americans would come, park their ships during the day, and bombard the Japanese. The Japanese only came at night. They were masters of the night action. Now, the Americans had the advantage because they had Henderson Field. They had aircraft. If the Japanese came during the day, the Americans could see them and attack them with the aircraft. They also had radar. But the Japanese didn't rely on things like that. They just relied on their excellent seamanship, and they came at night. They came at night, and they dominated the night. The Americans dominated the day, the Japanese at night. So finally, the Americans decided they had to do something. And in August 1942, they sent their fleet out at night. 4 American cruisers entered the Sound that was located between Guadalcanal, Saddle Island, and Florida Island. The Sound. They were going to rely on their radar to find the Japanese in the dark. And American radar was famous at this time. Boom, 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 boom. The Japanese, they relied on spotlights. The spotlights searched. And they found the American cruisers. And the Japanese let them have it. One American cruiser was sunk. The others were severely damaged. So damaged that they had to withdraw, and they left the Sound. They could not defend the Marines ashore from the Japanese. They retreated from the Sound. The Americans had lost the Battle of Savo Island in August of 1942. So where were the carriers? I talked about the importance of the carriers. Where were the American carriers that were so important? They were south of Savo Island, way down here. So why were they engaged? Well, it was complicated. Now, the admiral in charge of the carriers was the brilliant Admiral Fletcher, Frank Jack Fletcher. He was the best carrier admiral on the planet. He had been victorious at Coral Sea and at Midway. He was the victor admiral. But here's the problem. He always got mixed messages from his boss, Admiral King. Admiral King said, win battles, win battles, win battles, which he did. And Admiral King also said, don't lose any carriers. There are only 6 American carriers afloat. Don't lose any. Well, at every battle that Admiral Fletcher won, he lost a carrier. At Coral Sea, he lost to Lexington. At Midway, he lost to Yorktown. And Admiral King was furious. He was like, you can't lose my carriers. You've lost a third of my carriers. So Admiral Fletcher was like schizophrenic. He was like, I'm supposed to win battles, but I can't lose carriers. But I'm supposed to win battles, but I can't lose carriers. So he became paranoid and he fled south. He abandoned Guadalcanal. Well, the Marines ashore were furious. They said they'd been betrayed by the US Navy. They'd been abandoned. Where the hell were the carriers? So, later in August 1942, Admiral Fletcher turned around, obeying orders from Admiral Halsey and Admiral King to attack the Japanese carriers circling Guadalcanal. And Admiral Fletcher entered the waters. He brought with him 3 carriers, the Saratoga, the Enterprise, and the brand new American carrier, the Wasp. Now the Japanese confronted him with 3 of their own carriers, the Ryojo, the Shokaku, and the Zuikaku. 3 against 3. Now remember what I said. In a battle like this, it's who finds the other guy first, because once you find the enemy fleet, right? If you sink it, guess what? They can't launch any more planes against you, and whatever planes they launched have no place to go. They have to ditch in the ocean and die. Well, guess who found the first ship? The Americans. They found the Ryojo. But here's the thing. The Japanese admiral was brilliant because the Ryojo was bait. It was deliberately there for the Americans to find. It was way out where they could find it. And the Americans sank the Ryojo. It went down. Then the American planes, done torpedoing and dive bombing the Ryojo, flew home, and the Japanese planes followed them. They followed the American planes home to the carriers, and they attacked the American fleet. Their attack was devastating. The Saratoga torpedoed and dive bombed so bad it had to be withdrawn all the way to California for repairs, completely out of the theater, out of the campaign. The Enterprise, so badly bombed, it had to be withdrawn to port in Noumea. And finally, the Wasp, a brand new carrier, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and sent to the bottom of the Sound, which was now being called Iron Bottom Sound, because it was lined with sunken ships. The Japanese had been victorious. Again, like at Pearl Harbor, they'd been victorious. So what did they do? Did they press their advantage? No, the Japanese didn't do that. They weren't good on the follow-through. The 2 remaining Japanese carriers withdrew. They didn't bomb Henderson Field. They didn't bring in other ships. They withdrew. So once again, the Japanese had sacrificed the advantage that they had won at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons later in August 1942. I ran into the hospital. I need to have some news. I need to find out what was going on, but only an hour had passed. I thought, I'll buy some flowers. I'll go to the flower stand and get Michael some flowers. And I thought, no, that's hubris. That's acting like everything's going to be okay. I'm going to curse it. I can't buy flowers. Then I looked around me. The hospital was so antiseptic. It was so clean. It smelled of cleaning agent. It was like spotless. It felt so safe, but this isn't a place where safe things happened. In my view, this is a place where terrible things could happen. I felt gross. I felt confined. I couldn't stay in the hospital, so I ran back outside. I needed to be outside in the wind. with the clouds flowing over my head, with the smells of nature, with the dirt under my feet, the grass, all those beautiful leaves on the lawn. I need to be back out in the elements, away from the reality. I needed to escape. There was an admiral in the US Navy who wanted to get into the elements himself. His name was Scott, and he was determined to prove that the United States could fight a night action against the Japanese, that American radar and American know-how could beat the Japanese with their searchlights. So Admiral Scott set to sea in September 1942. He took with him 4 American cruisers, and he set them up in a line of battle between Savo Island and the big island of Guadacanal. So any Japanese force coming in to bombard or to reinforce would have to get past him. Also, he was hoping to pull the greatest strategic move that an admiral can pull in a battle like this. The Japanese were coming on with their cruisers, headed towards Admiral Scott. And Scott was in the perfect position because he was going to cross the T. He was going to cross the T of the oncoming Japanese ships. But his position got even better because the Japanese got paranoid. They couldn't figure out what was going on, right? They couldn't figure out what was going on. It was nighttime. They couldn't see anything. They didn't know if these ships were their ships. They had no idea. When these ships started firing, they panicked because they thought they were their own ships, that they were Japanese ships. So each of the Japanese admiral's ships turned to starboard. And as they came on, they turned to starboard. And as they came on, they turned to starboard, each one in turn presenting itself like a duck in a shooting gallery. The effect on the Japanese fleet was devastating. Not only had he crossed the T, but the Japanese panic had turned them into targets. And immediately, a Japanese cruiser was sunk. The other 2 Japanese cruisers were badly damaged and had to be withdrawn. Admiral Turner had proved that American radar could work at night and that he could interpose himself between Guadalcanal and the Japanese. The radar had been very confusing up to them because at night you couldn't tell what was out there. You couldn't tell if you were looking at islands, at your own ships. You couldn't tell, but he knew how to read his radar. So Admiral Scott withdrew from Iron Bottom Sound, a victor, the first victor of any of these battles of Guadalcanal. So what did the Japanese do? They lost. So naturally, one assumes they did nothing because when they were victorious, they did nothing. So why would they do anything now? That's not what they did. 2 nights later, they sent 2 battleships into Iron Bottom Sound. The Kondo and the Haruna. They parked themselves off of Guadalcanal and shelled Henderson Field. They shelled it with their 14-inch guns. Up until now, the only ships that had shelled Henderson Field were cruisers, which had 8-inch guns. The 14-inch guns were devastating. They devastated Henderson Field. They showed it up. There were 90 aircraft at Henderson Field. By the time the Congo and the Haruna got done, there were 40. It was a devastating attack. Devastating attack. It was horrific. From then on, the men ashore always referred to this attack as the bombardment. There were many bombardments, but this was the bombardment because it was a night of horror. Before the sun came up, they withdrew because the Japanese would be exposed in those shallow waters to plane attack if they were around. It was a completely successful operation, and it came after a defeat. Still, the Japanese were much more bold than the Americans. I looked up at that hospital. It was still looming above me. And the time was crawling by. I was barely distracting myself. I couldn't stop thinking about that hospital. I dove back into my book. Now, Admiral Halsey was determined to get his carriers back into action. The first time had been a disaster, so he sent his carriers back out in October of 1942 at the Battle of Santa Cruz. 2 carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, which had been repaired. Well, the Japanese found them, and boom, boom, the Hornet was sunk, destroyed. And the Enterprise, so badly damaged, it had to once again be withdrawn from the battle. It was out of the fight. And guess what? That was it. That was the end of the carriers. There were no more American carriers. They were out of the fight. It was a disaster for the Americans. So something had to be done about these battleships getting into Iron Bottom Sound. If they came again, they would have to be stopped. So Admiral Halsey turned to a newly minted admiral. His name was Admiral Daniel Callahan. He was a brilliant man. So brilliant that he'd been naval advisor to President Roosevelt. He was a San Franciscan. He went to San Ignatius Preparatory, and then he raised his family in Alameda, and he was incredibly clever. He was smart. He was determined. He was the man for the job. And he was a bit fatalistic. I couldn't stop thinking about that hospital. I had to go deeper. I had to become something different. I couldn't think for 4 hours. I couldn't obsess on that hospital. I had to do something different. So I would become Admiral Callahan. I would enter into this fight. Admiral Callahan was headed out to defeat the Japanese Navy in Iron Bottom Sound in yet another night action. And I would become Admiral Callahan. Now, Admiral Callahan was very clever. He'd studied naval tactics between the wars. And his cruisers were all what was called treaty cruisers. And treaty cruisers worked best when they were up close to battleships. The closer they got, the more effective they got. And Callahan knew this. And so on the night of November 12th, 1942, a Thursday, he headed out with his fleet into Iron Bottom Sound. Word had come in from coast watchers and aircraft that the Japanese were advancing towards Guadacanal. They were bringing not only a bombarding fleet, they were also bringing reinforcements, 11 transport ships. If they got a bombardment going in Iron Bottom Sound, they would reduce Henderson Field for all time. That would be the end of Henderson Field. There would never again be any possibility of planes flying out of it. Also, if they got 11 transport ships in, that'd be a whole nother division, and the Japanese would win the Battle of Guadalcanal. So Admiral Callahan would have to win this fight. And his Navy set out on the night of Thursday, November 12th, 1942, and they were headed towards the enemy in the early hours of Friday, November 13th, 1942. Admiral Callahan had 5 cruisers. He organized them in line of battle, north, south. His flagship, the USS San Francisco. Also in his fleet was Admiral Scott, the victor of the fighting where he crossed the T. So these men were ready, and they were the best. Arranged in front of them, just north, was their destroyer fleet. 4 destroyers. Now, destroyers are, of course, much smaller than cruisers, but they're incredibly effective weapons because they carry torpedoes, and torpedoes are incredibly effective against all ships. But a destroyer has to get close, and it has to achieve firing position. To the south were 4 more American destroyers, lined up north-south in line of battle. They'd been told that the Japanese were approaching, and they were, under Admiral Abe of the Japanese Navy. The Japanese were coming on in 3 columns. To the north was a destroyer column coming on. Now remember, these could be dangerous because these destroyers carried torpedoes. 5 in the north. Just to the south were 6 more Japanese destroyers also coming on, under command of Admiral Abe. His job to escort transport ships full of thousands of Japanese troops coming up in the rear. And in the middle of all this, forming a 3rd column, was a Japanese cruiser leading 2 Japanese battleships, the Hai and the Kirishima. Now, technically, there was no ship in the American line that could take on those battleships. But look what happened. Look what Callahan was doing. Once again, like Admiral Scott, he was crossing the Japanese T. All of his broadsides would be aimed at the front of the Japanese Navy. In other words, they only had 4 guns in the front. He was bringing 8 guns on every ship against the Japanese. He was crossing the T. It was incredible. And his radar was working. He could see everything. He could see everything. It was going to happen. He was going to sink this whole Navy. But things started to go wrong just after midnight on Friday, November 13th, 1942. You see, in order to achieve firing position, his destroyers had to point their bows at the Japanese ships. So the first destroyer captain in the American fleet asked for permission. He didn't get it, so he turned anyway to get his destroyer pointed at the Japanese. Unfortunately, all the other destroyers followed his lead because they wanted to do the same thing. And now all the destroyers in the front were turning towards the Japanese. This created a traffic jam. The cruisers started crashing into the destroyers. They started crashing into each other. They started turning towards the Japanese to keep from crashing into the destroyers. And then the other destroyers in the rear started turning too. And suddenly everybody was turning and steaming right into the Japanese fleet. Now, at this time, in naval warfare, ships were not meant to be this close. They were supposed to fight from a distance. That's why they had radar. They weren't supposed to be this close to each other. This was turning into a dogfight, a snarling, vicious dogfight with animals right next to each other. Admiral Callahan didn't know what to do. His whole battle plan had fallen apart. He was no longer crossing the T. So he sent out an order. Odd ships in the line fired to starboard. Even ships in the line fired to port. It was desperate. He just wanted to make sure that every Japanese ship was being fired upon by somebody, so he sent out this desperate order. And now the fleets were intertwined. It was like a weave, like a quilt. It had become a piece of fabric, and ships at this time were never meant to do this. They were meant to fire each other from great distances. Again, the Americans were relying on their radar to guide them. And the Japanese, of course, were relying on their searchlights to find the Americans. But Admiral Callahan remembered something. He remembered that a searchlight points in 2 directions, and he directed everybody to fire towards the Japanese searchlights. It was incredible. All the ships were firing at once. It was complete confusion. It has been referred to as a barroom brawl, is what it became, a barroom brawl after the barroom lights have been shot out. There's complete confusion. Admiral Scott on the Atlanta was firing at the Japanese battleship Haie. Japanese battleship was returning fire, and eventually the Japanese battleship Haie overwhelmed the Atlanta. But the Atlanta was not only being attacked by the Japanese, it was also being attacked by the USS San Francisco, accidentally firing upon its sister ship, the USS Atlanta. Admiral Callahan had completely, seemingly lost control of everything, and he realized that his own ship that he was on, the San Francisco, was firing on the Atlanta. Admiral Scott was actually killed by fire from the San Francisco. As soon as Admiral Callahan realized what was happening, he called a ceasefire, but it was too late. The Atlanta was already sinking. It was going down, destroyed. And then what happened was the Haie, because it had sunk with the San Francisco helping, the Atlanta, it turned its whole fire on the USS San Francisco, the flagship. And Admiral Callahan was killed by Japanese gunfire from the battleship Haie. The battle was a snarling brawl. Nobody knew what was going on. Destroyers were firing torpedoes. Cruisers were firing at destroyers. Battleships were firing at cruisers. It was complete confusion. Eventually, 2 American cruisers were sunk, the Atlanta and the Juno. Along with those ships, 4 American destroyers were sunk. The Japanese losses, 2 destroyers. So who won? Well, the Americans lost more ships, but the Japanese started to withdraw. They started to take their ships out of Iron Bottom Sound, and they withdrew. Not all their ships were even damaged. Some of them had still had some fight left in them, but the Japanese did not push any advantage. Their ships began to withdraw. The battleship Kirishima, its escort, the cruiser, the northern force of destroyers, all withdrew. There would be no bombardment that night. There would be no delivery of transports that night, nothing. The American ships withdrew, trying to pick up survivors, but in some cases they couldn't because there were Japanese submarines lurking, so it was dangerous. And so eventually everybody had cleared their way out of Iron Bottom Sound. There were no ships left, none afloat, that is, except for one. The Japanese battleship, the Haiti. Everybody had focused their fire on it. Admiral Callahan, Admiral Scott in the Atlanta, all of the destroyers, all the cruisers in the American Navy had focused their fire on the Haiti, and it was damaged. It was in terrible shape. Its rudder had been shot off. Iron had been pressed against its engines. It was going in a circle, steaming in a circle out of control, and the sun was rising. And when the sun came up, the swarm of American aircraft would come up out of Henderson Field and sink it. So what did it do? They took the Haiti and they tried to hide north of Savo Island, where nobody they hoped could see them. And they tried to repair the ship. They spent the whole night trying to repair the ship. And then the sun rose and they tried to repair the ship. And guess what happened? The aircraft from Henderson suddenly found it. They found the Haiti trying to hide behind Savo Island, and then they swarmed over it. All day long, they kept coming, swarming, attacking it all day, desperate. Hundreds of aircrafts, hundreds of sorties launched against bombers, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, launched day. They kept coming. Remember, the day belonged to the Americans, not the Japanese, and the aircraft swarmed over it. The Japanese kept abandoning the ship and then going back, and then abandoning the ship and then going back, and then abandoning the ship. The Admiral Yamamoto, head of the Japanese Navy, said, abandon the ship. The captain on board said no. He kept going back all day long, and eventually they said, get off that ship, abandon it. They were going to sink their own ship with torpedoes to make sure it went down, but then no. Admiral Yamamoto said, leave it there. It will distract the Americans. Let them waste their bombs on it. And eventually, it blew up and sank. The result of all this, a stunning victory for the Americans. The transport ships had never made it through. They'd all turned back, all 11 of them. They didn't come through that night. The Japanese did not press forward and bombard Henderson Field. They could have destroyed it that night. They didn't. They were so unnerved by Admiral Callahan's boldness that they withdrew. They retired. And the naval battle of Guadacanal on November 13th, 1942, won the victory at sea. I realized it was time. Somehow I distracted myself. I don't know how. Always in the back of my head, always in the front of my head, always my head was full of what I knew would come. At the end of 6 hours, I walked inside into the hospital. And I said, hi, I'm here to find out about the surgery. And I gave them my husband's name. And they said, well, the doctor's just coming out of surgery now. He'll call you. Just wait here. And I went and sat down in that antiseptic lobby. It was horrible in there. I could barely sit. I was almost ready to spring out of my seat. I was moving around in my chair, nervous. And then the receptionist said, I've got the surgeon on the phone. I went up. I took the phone. I listened. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to curse it. I didn't want to take any action whatsoever. And the surgeon said, somebody there? I said, yeah, I'm just calling to find out about my husband. And he started rattling off all this terminology. I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. He was talking about incisions and cuts and removal and tissue, and I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. It was so complicated, but I started listening not so much to his words, but to his tone, which was incredibly unprofessional, almost bragging. And I began to realize that he was giving me a detailed account of a surgery that had been completely successful, which meant that my beautiful boy was up there coming out of surgery. And the worst thing imaginable had not happened. So he finally told me he's going to go into ICU, and then you can come visit him, but it's going to be a few hours. You can't come up now. And I said, oh, okay, fine. And I took my book, this same book, which I've had ever since. And I went and I got some pizza and a Coke. I had a whole bunch of junk food. And when the time had passed, I came back. I came back to see my glorious hubby in ICU. I'd never even been in an ICU unit before. I was like, wow, this is ICU. There was this bed, this big bed with my beautiful boy in it, surrounded by more equipment than I'd ever seen in my life. And I walked up to him and I held his little hand and I said, "You're here." And he smiled and he squeezed my hand. I was so proud of him. And then this big nurse, huge, came up and started tucking him in. He said, "My name is Kent. How are you? Are you the husband? It's nice to meet you." He did so well, and he was tucking him in. And I thought, thank God, he's got a gay nurse in ICU. He's in good hands. And I stayed with him there. I stayed with him there holding his hand. And the bed was so high, I was holding it like this, surrounded by all that equipment. And for the first time that day, I felt safe. The hospital made me feel safe. It was no longer this looming tragedy off to my left outside the park. It was a place where wonderful things happened. So what happened at Guadacanal after that? Well, the Japanese kept trying to deliver their transports. They had 11 of them. The Americans sank 7. Eventually, the Japanese had to beach them. They barely got a fraction of their men ashore. The battleships did come back. They did bombard, but they didn't stay. They didn't linger. And finally, the American battleships came into it under the command of a brilliant man named Willis Lee. And he sank the Kirishima, which was the other battleship. The Hai and now the Kirishima, sunk by American battleships, the new style. And eventually the tide turned at Guadalcanal. And the Americans were able to secure it and then move on up the Solomon Islands. And eventually, all the way to Japan in victory. And then the Pacific, for better or worse, truly did become an American lake. What lessons were learned from all this? Well, I don't think this battle distracted me. I don't think the leaves or the thoughts or things I read ever completely distracted me, but they passed time. And how about the battle itself? Was Callahan actually a talented admiral or just somebody who lost control of things? It seems like confusion. He's been condemned from that day to this. And there was enormous confusion in this battle. First of all, the ships had never served together. These ships were serving for the first time. It was horribly organized. And his line of battle, his crossing the T, was really quite crude. And it fell apart the instant somebody wanted to do something different and he didn't get back to them. He didn't respond. Then they just did it. The whole line fell apart. Also, the radios were a mess. Yes, the radar was working that night. It was working that night, but everybody was talking on the radios. Every time the radar tried to communicate something, there was all sorts of chatter on the radios. Nobody could understand what was going on. And some of the chatter was incredibly pedantic. Like every time a new course change came through, this prima donna who wanted to prove he was an actor would get on the radio and announce to everybody, change of course to 120 with perfectly articulated English like he was on stage. And it was slow and everybody had to wait for this thing to happen before the important news about the radars would come through. Change of course to 120. Also, there were other problems. Why was Admiral Scott put in charge of all this? He'd already won a night action against the Japanese, the Battle of Cape Esperance. Remember? He won a night action. He crossed the T. Well, he didn't have seniority. Admiral Callahan had 15 days of seniority. But I'll tell you something. For all the condemnations of history, Callahan's behavior was impressive because he knew from what he'd been trained between the wars that cruisers could do well against Japanese battleships if they got in close. And that's exactly what he did. He got in close. He lost control. He ended up killing Admiral Scott himself, but how could he avoid that? He used his radar, he went with his instincts, and he got in close. And this is even scarier because I told you that cruisers aren't much of a match for Japanese battleships. I think when Admiral Callahan learned that his cruiser force was going out against Japanese battleships, I think he decided that he was being sent on a suicide mission. And the best he could do was get up against those battleships and hammer away at them and scare them. I think Admiral Callahan basically knew he was sending his fleet not only into harm's way, but to its destruction. A lesson. It wasn't about saving ships. This was such a desperate fight. It was about fighting until your ship was sunk. And that's what Admiral Callahan did. When we talk about suicide bombers and kamikazes, it happens in every army, every navy. Somebody just decides, if I don't do this, it's not going to happen. I've got to scare them. And if I scare them by giving up my own life doing it, I really think he sailed on a suicide mission. And that's why he was so bold. And that, ultimately, horrifyingly, is why it worked. Legacies. What legacy has he left us? Well, the bridge of the USS San Francisco, where he died, is out at Land's End. You can actually see shell holes from the Japanese battleship Hai. You can see them there in the ship. You can go to Land's End and you can see where Admiral Callahan died. Also, I think this is another interesting legacy. Do you remember Clint Eastwood's name in the movie Dirty Harry? Callahan, a San Francisco cop, a San Francisco admiral. I think, although I've never confirmed this, that it's actually some sort of tribute to Admiral Callahan. There was one horrifying tragedy that closed this event, and that was the Juno. It was an American cruiser. It was sunk in that huge battle. It went down, and hundreds of its men went into the water. Many of them were in the water for 10 days, being attacked by sharks. The sharks went after any man who left the clumps and tried to swim for an island. They got them. Then they started going for men who were hanging on nets off of lifeboats. One man had his entire shoulder bitten off. He scrambled up onto a lifeboat and collapsed there with blood dripping into the ocean. The other man on the lifeboat started to retch. It was so horrifying what they were looking at. And the blood dripping into the ocean was attracting sharks. The man with no shoulder realized what he was doing, attracting sharks, horrifying the men. He rolled over the side, paddled with one arm away from the lifeboat, and allowed himself to be consumed by sharks. On the Juno were 5 brothers, the Sullivan brothers. They had embarked on an enlistment campaign. They were going to show that they could serve together. The Navy said, no, please, please, please. They said, we will not enlist if we can't serve together. So all 5 of them were on the Juno. 4 of them died when the Juno blew up. The 5th Sullivan went into the water. He survived 3 days, and then he was consumed by sharks. All 5 of the Sullivan boys died in the sinking of the Juno. Eventually, Michael and I went home, and eventually we did go to Paris, but it wasn't in extremis. It wasn't the end of anything. He was in remission, and we just went to have fun. It was my adventure, a horrible one, a scary one. My distraction techniques, reverting to childhood, trying to escape into the lawn covered with the leaves. But it was just passing time. Unlike the Battle of Guadacanal, it achieved nothing other than to pass the time before I could go and face the reality, which fortunately, wonderfully, was deliverance. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm John Fisher, and this has been the Battle of Guadacanal. You were a terrific audience. It was great having you here with me tonight. I've been presenting a solo performance a week since the onset of COVID-19. This was my 50th performance, and I couldn't do it without you. We have a number of wonderful programs coming up. On Tuesday, we have a free reading of a play called Emergency Contact. It's a terrific play. I hope you can join us 7 o'clock on Tuesday. And then I'll be back next week with a COVID adventure, something that actually happened during COVID-19 on Thursday at 8 o'clock. We also have a special performance coming up in April. It's called Pandemic Performances. It should be terrific. I hope you can join us for that, April 2nd. And then in May, we have Mark Nadler joining us, the wonderful cabaret artist from New York, and a brand new show all the way in June. And then my essential service projects all the way through, continuing until I get the shot. But more than anything, thank you for being here. If you'd like to give us a donation to support these programs, and as you can imagine, Theater Rhinoceros is struggling in these difficult COVID-19 times. You can do so by sending me a check in my COVID-19 office, John Fisher, Theater Rhinoceros, 91 Central Avenue, number 102, San Francisco, California, 94117, or go online and go to therhino.org and you can make a donation on PayPal. You can also find out there about all of our wonderful shows coming up on Zoom. And hopefully one day we'll be back in the elements, like myself in Lafayette Park, and Admiral Scott and Admiral Callahan, out in the smells, out in nature, out in buildings. And we hope to see you there again, live once more, not on Zoom, but in person. But for now, thank you for joining me on Zoom and on Facebook Live. You guys were terrific, real winners. Good night.